Do we start? I guess yes. Yeah, thanks for having me here. I haven't talked to a live audience since COVID, so it feels very nice actually. A little bit about myself. I'm Panos. I come from Greece. My full name is Panagiotis Vasilikos. So if you looked at the talk description, so you probably figured out that I'm from Greece already. But I've been living in Denmark for the last 8 years, and I'm currently a security engineer at IKEA, and I work here in Malmö. But today, I want to talk to you about CTFs and how you can learn hacking skills and how you can actually master them. I choose to talk about this topic a lot because for me it has been the main way of learning offensive security skills, and it has actually helped me throughout my entire career. I have a little bit of an unusual background compared to other people that work in this field. So I started as a mathematician. I have a bachelor in abstract mathematics. And then at some point, I figured out that all those things that I was doing, they can be used in a field of computer science, which is called program analysis, where basically you can write other tools which analyze your code and they detect vulnerabilities. And so I moved to Denmark to do this, and I did my master's and my PhD on that. And while doing this, some of my colleagues there, they actually introduced me to CTFs. And that's how I started. And eventually, I managed to land a job as a pen tester, and I was also doing code reviews. So what I'm trying to say here, if you are a student, or if you are someone who is trying to change careers, and he wants or she wants to jump into cybersecurity, CTFs are the way. I did it, you can do it as well. And today, I'm gonna explain to you what CTFs are about, and I'm actually gonna go through a walkthrough of a CTF, and I'm gonna show you how much you can learn by just doing one CTF. All right. Okay, CTF, it stands for Capture the Flag, and CTFs comes as a platform or as competitions, and they consist of a set of security challenges where basically the goal is there to solve the challenge, and by the end of the challenge, you are gonna find a secret file, which is called the flag, hence the name Capture the Flag. So this is the goal. You need to solve the security challenge and find the flag. Once you do that, then you have to go to a dashboard, you submit the flag, and then you get some points back. Now, the number of points, it really depends on the difficulty of the challenge that you're doing. So there are some challenges which are pretty straightforward. So you only have to execute a command. So maybe the challenge would be to read the flag directly. So you will need to know the Linux command to do that. Or they could be like full-blown attacks where you have to chain multiple attacks together, and then you will have to end up reading the flag in this way. You can play the challenges both individually or in teams. And there are actually two main types of CTFs. We have the Jeopardy style, and this is what we're going to see today. And for the Jeopardy style, you have all kinds of security fields in the challenges. You have web exploitation, you have binary exploitation, you have reverse engineering, you have forensics, whatever you can think about that. And the challenge, the way that they're structured is usually you get a hint and then you get it from there on solving the challenge. And then there are also the more advanced stuff, the attack and defense games, where basically you play that as a team, and each team has its own server, and they have to defend this server, and the other teams are trying to attack it. Actually, I haven't played this type of CTF, so we can maybe try it here sometime. Good. Today, we're going to look at the CTF challenge, which is offered by Pico CTF. And Pico CTF has been developed by Carnegie Mellon University. It runs once per year, I believe, but they offer also a platform which is called Pico Gym, and you can go there and get access to all the previous CTFs. So I highly recommend it if you want to try some challenges. And they have all sorts of levels, beginners to advanced. So the challenge of today is called BitHug, and it's a web application. BitHug is basically a very simplified version of GitHub. It's a web application that allows you to create repositories. You can push your code there. You can add collaborators, etc. All that stuff that you do with repositories. So for this challenge, what we had access to was the source code of the application. We had the Docker container, which we could install on our local machine, and we could play with it. And we also had the running instance of the web application where the actual flag was located there. So for the rest of the talk, I will be showing you my methodology of how I approach this challenge. And let's keep the session interactive. So I will be showing like a lot of code and stuff. So if you don't understand something, so please let me know. Okay, so but a little bit of background. So BitHug is a Node.js application. It's written in a framework which is called Express. Anyone here knows the Express framework? Yeah, some people do. Very good. And the Express framework basically supports a concept which is called roots. And roots basically describe the application of the logic of your application. So a root has three main things. It has an HTTP method, a path pattern, and the code to be executed. So for example, here we have two roots, router.get/API/home and some code. It actually means that I'm willing to accept GET requests at API/home, and whenever this happens, I'm going to execute this part of code, which could be like return like a welcome page or something like this. It could be anything there. We can also have like dynamic variables within the path patterns. So this is another example of a root. And router.post/API/column username. This means that this is a string which could be anything. Slash my data and then my code. So basically here, for instance, it could be, I could make a post request to this root with /API/panos /my data, and then this root would be called. And you can also impose an order through the roots, and you can say, okay, for instance, I would like this root to be checked first. If it matches the path here, then the next one, etc. Now, the first thing that I'm doing when I'm dealing with this kind of challenges, or when I was doing like code reviews or pen tests, is basically to create a high-level architecture diagram of the application. I mean, security doesn't come out of the blue, right? You first need to understand how the application works, and then you need to find its weaknesses. So BitHug looks something like that. And of course, I didn't came up with this without looking at the code and without interacting with the application. So basically, we have a front end which is written in JavaScript, HTML, and this is another JavaScript framework, Angular. And then the backend is organized using 4 different JavaScript modules, let's say, and those modules are basically collections of roots. So we have the authentication and authorization module. This is where things are checked first. So whenever you make a request, whatever piece of code exists there will be called. And this piece of code uses an implementation of a class which is called the Auth Manager. And this class basically has access to an SQL database with all the registered users, the active sessions, the repositories, etc. And it actually tries to determine if the user is already authenticated or if a user tries to log in, etc. Then we move to the web module. And this is basically the core of the application's logic. And then you have some standard routes here, login, logout. You register your home page, you create a repository. And this module, again, it uses the authentication manager in order to take authentication and authorization decisions. And it also makes use of another class, which is the Git manager, which basically stores all the Git repos into an SQL database. So it can use this implementation here to fetch the Git repos. Then we have the Git module, which is basically an interface which allows you to interact with the application directly with Git, so from the CLI. And this supports all the standard Git protocol calls, so you can push code, you can download your code, you can clone your code, etc. I'm not going to go through that, but basically, again, this module is using the Git manager and also something which is called Webhook, which I'm going to explain later what it does. And again, it's the standard thing. It's interacting with the SQL database. So finally, if none of those paths get matched, then you will get to the static module, and then you will be served the main JavaScript file of the front end. What else do we have? Well, we have 3 different access levels. So we could be admins, and we could have access to all the repositories. We could be a user, and we have access to our own repository only, or we have access to repositories where other people have given access to us. And then we could be the, we could be the non-user, which is basically unauthenticated. Are there any questions so far with the application? Yeah.
These details that you present here, you find it out yourself or you were presented with it?
No, I draw this. So just I extracted this from looking at the code and interacting with the application.
Easy enough to do that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I said, I want to show you also a methodology of how to attack like a web application. I was actually doing that when I was doing code reviews and pen tests. I was coming up with a diagram. So, yeah. Okay, let's do some source code review then. So this is the source code for the registration route. And while I was looking at that, I immediately saw where the flag would be located. I'm going to walk you through the code, and we can see if we have any questions. So this is this route, /API/register. It expects a post request, and then it looks at the body of the request, and it looks for a username and the password. So that's a standard post request. And then it does some type checking. So those are very good practice for developers. So if you are a developer, this is like a must thing that you should do. It checks if the username that has been provided is of type string. It checks if it matches a certain regular expression. And it also checks if the password is of type string. So if any of those tests fail, it will actually raise an error. If you provide a good username and password, it's going to call the authentication manager, and it's going to call the register method, and it's going to just create a new user. Once this call has been finished, then I'm going to go and generate a token for my user, and I'm going to put it in the cookie header so I can return it back to the HTTP response. But then it goes and does something strange. So basically, it goes and creates a new repository, and it calls the Git manager for that, and it passes to it this string underscore slash the value of my username dot git, and what this thing means here is basically it creates a repository with my username in the admin's space. So they use this underscore symbol to basically say that this repository belongs to admin. So that's how they define the admin user. I mean, in other cases, let's say that I wanted to create my repository, then that would be something like panos slash my repository.git, but now it's underscore slash my username.git. And what it then does is basically it initializes the README file and it puts the flag of the challenge inside there. So the goal of this CTF is actually to access a repository with name Panos, which lives in the space of admin. And once we access that, then we can read the file, the README file, and then we can get the flag. That's the goal. Any questions? Very good. Some more code review. Very important when we do pen tests and code reviews, we look at how the authentication and authorization works for the application. One of the things that developers quite often they get wrong, and it's one of the most important things when it comes to security. So this is the authentication code. What happens here is whenever I make a request, this piece of code actually checks if there is a cookie with a session token appended to it. And then it checks if this token is of type string, and it actually calls the authentication manager to see if there is a session in the database with this particular value. So this is if you have been already authenticated and you are making a new request to the application. So if you already have a cookie. If that's not the case, then it's probably the case that the user is trying to log in this time. And the application is checking for the authorization header, and it's actually checking to see if you are trying to log in with HTTP basic authorization. And the way that this authentication method works is that you take the username and the password, and then you concatenate them with a column, and then you base 64 that. So you have Panos column, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, base 64 that, put it into a header and send it to the application. If this doesn't work, well, of course, if this works, then you are an authenticated user. And if this doesn't work, then again, something strange happens. So there is also another way to be authenticated to the application. So what's going on here is I'm looking at the request that I received, and I'm actually looking at the IP packet, and I'm trying to fetch the source IP of the packet. And if this IP is localhost in IPv4 notation or IPv6 notation, that's what it says here, then you are basically an admin. So if I make calls, let's say, so this runs in a VM or something, and I do some SSH to the VM, and then I make calls to the application from this same IP, then basically I would be authenticated as admin. And if none of those things work, then I'm not authenticated, basically. All good? Great. And now, of course, you have to go through all the rest of the files. You have to send some payloads to the application, etc., all those things. And you come up with a map of different threads. Let's go through them. XSS. Who knows what XSS is? Yeah? Could someone help me here? Like, give me a description of what XSS can do? Do we have a volunteer? yeah, so basically you can inject a malicious script which runs on the front end, and then this code will be executed on whoever executes this code. So I thought that, I mean, if there was an XSS vulnerability, so I could potentially send my malicious XSS script to an admin, and then the admin could basically execute that, and he could add me to his repository, and then I could get access to this secret repository. That would be a valid threat if you would be doing like a normal pen test or source code review, but of course, this is not in scope, but because this is a CTF and there is no admin to send this payload to, but you could have thought of this. CSRF, any volunteers? What it is? Okay. So basically, it's kind of similar to XSS, but it's only like if you could send a URL to the admin, like a phishing email, and once he clicks the URL, so you don't inject any code actually. The application makes like a post request or something that modifies the backend. And I thought that you could also do it here. Again, the same logic you send to the admin, CSRF URL, and then he adds you to this secret repository, and then you get access to whatever you would like to read. But this is also out of scope. OWASP command injection. Any volunteers? Okay, I can go through them then. Yeah, so basically when you are, so the application under the hood, whenever it creates Git repositories or does something with the Git repositories, it spawns, it spawns a new shell under the hood, and it calls Git, and it passes some arguments to it. And those arguments are basically controlled by us. I mean, for instance, it could, one of the arguments could be the name of the repository, and what could go wrong here? Yeah. Yes? Anything. Exactly. So basically, maybe you could just put a semicolon after the username, or after the name of the repository, and then you could inject another command there, and then this command could give you access to the Git repository that you would like to. But this is also not working here because they do some input validation, and then you cannot inject all those nice characters that hackers like. Yeah, some other standard threats. SQL injection, I mean, we have an SQL database. We could try to attack that and basically fetch the entire repository on our side. It doesn't work. They use SQL parameterized queries here. CV exploitation, this is a Node.js application. It has certain dependencies. Some of those dependencies could be vulnerable to a known vulnerability, but I checked all of their packages, and they were all up to date with no known vulnerabilities. So this also doesn't apply here. Mass assignment. So this thread here is basically if I could send a request that represents like a user object, like my username and the type of user that I am, and I could put there admin, and then the entire request would be consumed by the application, and it would create a new user like me that would be admin, but this also doesn't work there. And then we have another attack, which is broken authorization, because, yeah, I mean, the application does something strange when you call it from localhost. So I could try to exploit that. There is something which is called SCAPI, which allows you to craft your own IP packets. And I could basically make a request and have the short destination of the packet as localhost and send this to the application. Then I would be admin. But why this doesn't work? Why I cannot do that? Any ideas? Anyone knows how TCP works? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So basically, before I send my payload, I will have to do the handshake. So what is going to happen there, I'm going to send this crafted packet with localhost as the source destination, and then the application will actually try to talk to itself to complete the handshake. So I will never be able to send my payload because I will never be able to complete the handshake. However, if you have ever looked at IoT code, in IoT they use a lot of UDP type protocols, and in UDP you don't have to go through this handshake, so you can directly send your payload there. It could work there, but they're not using UDP. And the last attack, which is the one that is going to give us the flag, is a server-side request forgery attack, and it has to do with the webhooks. And I'm just going to explain this to you now. Okay. So a webhook is basically an event-driven mechanism which allows you to say, for instance, register an endpoint or a server that you control, and whenever someone interacts with your code, for instance, if it makes a new push to your code, you can send some data to this endpoint. If you are developing in GCP, there are those type of triggers all over GCP, but also in GitHub, you can find those webhooks. So the pseudocode for this is like, if a Git action has been received, then make a post request with my data to the endpoint that I control. And that looks, on the web application, it looks like that. So I'm registering the server that I control. I'm having a payload here that I would like to send. Maybe I would like to keep record of some alerts whenever someone is pushing code to my repository, and then I'm sending some data to this alerting system that I have created. But you can do that. Let's see how the code looks for that. That's the API route for Git for whenever you are pushing code to your repository. And what happens here, I'm looking at the body of the request, and I'm getting a reference to a Git repository, and I'm calling the webhook manager with this particular repository, and I'm trying to see if there are any webhooks registered for this repository. And then I'm creating some options, and I'm iterating through all the registered webhooks for this repository. I'm taking the URL that the webhook is pointing to, and I'm actually also constructing the body of the data that I will have to send to this endpoint that I have registered. And then I'm using fetch to make a post request to this URL, and yeah, I'm just gonna send this data to the URL. Pretty simple. So whenever I make a git push, I'm posting this data to whatever I have registered there. Okay, so attack attempt number 1, which didn't work. What I have to do? So remember that our goal is to access the repository with name, well, I had the username panva.git, so that's the name of the repository, which lives in the admin's space. Yeah, that's an underscore here. So I have to access this repository. Okay, I'm creating a new repository that I control, and I'm registering a webhook, and the webhook points to localhost, port 1823. This is where the web application runs. And it actually points to this repository that I want to push data to. The way that access control works for BitHug is basically that there is an access.conf file which contains a list of all the valid users who have access to this repository. So my goal would be Um, so the payload of that I'm registering for the webhook should be that I'm modifying this file and I'm putting my name into this. So what would happen now is I will make a push request to my arbitrary repo that I created here. Okay, the server will see that there is a webhook registered for that. This webhook points to 127.0.0.1. This is the local host. Okay, that's myself. I will make a request to myself. Whenever I make a request to myself, from myself, this is admin. So I can access this space. And I will just add the username Panva uh, to this repository. So he would be able to have access to the README file of this repository. Does it make sense? And I will go to this. I'm not going to show you the payload, but I'm actually going to explain to you how I created it. But it's basically a push request to Git. So you need to create this access file, and then you need to add it to your changes, and then you need to commit this file, and then you need to push it to this repository, and then you need to capture this request, which have all those changes. So this access.conf file, it actually lives in the space of the repository. Yes?
I'm looking at the URL. It's HTTP
Yeah.
without security. Does these contests always run without security or?
I can't
server?
remember now. I can't remember if it was HTTP or HTTPS, but I think it was HTTP.
Okay. Is it much more trouble if
No,
if you have a web server
no.
with security?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
So basically, TLS here would protect you from a man-in-the-middle attack or something like that if someone intercepts your requests, but it doesn't really help you with those kind of attacks.
Because you own your own server. So kind of in this.
No, I
context.
mean, I can, well, this request is going to be initiated by the server to the server itself, and it can just be done. I mean, the encryption here, it doesn't really matter. Okay, but this didn't work. Why it didn't work? Because whenever you register those webhooks, there is a URL validation part which takes place. And so this is the code. So whenever I'm going to register a webhook, this check, I'm not sure why they were doing that, but if you are an admin or an unauthenticated user, you're not able to register a webhook. But if you are a normal user, basically then I'm going to look at the URL that you are giving me for the webhook, the payload that you would like me to send to this URL, and the content type. I'm going to fetch that from the body of the request. And then I'm going to construct this URL object, and then I'm going to do certain checks. So I'm going to check if you are actually sending to a URL that has port 80 or the empty port, which is port 80 again. And if that's not the case, then you will be rejected. So basically, you are not going to be able to register this URL. And the problem is just, if I go a slide back, that our application runs at port 1823. And we cannot reach it because, I mean, we cannot register a URL which points there. There are some other checks as well. So if you are sending to localhost or localhost written in IPv4 notation, you will also be rejected. But you can bypass that because you can use IPv6 notation. We saw that in the beginning, how you can write localhost in IPv6. So you would be able to bypass that. And there are some other checks as well which are not relevant. Do you have any idea of how I can bypass that? Yes.
Do you need to do a get, or is it a post? If it's a get, then you can do a redirect from some other page, if it follows redirect, that is.
Oh, yeah, I like your thinking. It's a post request, but why you cannot do a redirect with a post?
Because it won't resend the body. It might do that on some split code, but I don't remember.
Actually, that's the solution. Yeah, actually, this is the solution. Very good. Yeah, so what you have to do, you basically have to spin out a server that you control. This is my new server where the webhook would go. And then you have to make this server to accept post requests, and it should respond with a 307 reply. So basically, this type of response, it says, repeat this request with the same body and send it to some different location. And then again, the payload of the webhook should be the same. It should be this push action where it changes this access.conf file and adds me as a user. So what is going to happen now, I'm going to make a push request. Okay. I can register this webhook because it points to a server with the empty port, which is the 80 port in this case. Very good. So the server would say, okay, I will make this post request. It will go to my server, and my server would say, you know what? I don't know what I can do with this, but I know how someone else who can do something with this. And it's basically you. And then the server will just repeat the request to itself, and it will make all those modifications that I would like it to do for me. And I will get access to the repository of the admin, and then I can go and read the README file. That's the solution. Yeah, and back to your question. So what you, in order to create the payload, you can actually configure Git with a proxy, and there is a very well-known proxy for when you are playing with web applications. It's called burp. Yeah, you need to create your own repository on CLI. Then you need to create an orphan branch. You need to create this file which contains your name. You need then to do add, commit, push your changes. Burp will gonna capture this request, and then you can read this request and base64 it, and then you can actually put it into the webhook registration. But that's how you create the request. Yeah, and the server is something very simple. It's a Python server. If you are at home, you can do something like port forwarding at your router. I don't recommend that, but I did it for solving the challenge. It's better if you use something like Heroku or GCP, whatever, to spin out your server to solve the challenge. But you can basically allow external connections to your home as well. And the server, it does, it sends this 307 report. It defines a new location, and then that's all. This CTF is inspired by a real vulnerability, which was reported by a researcher at HackerOne for GitLab. And the exploitation was basically much easier. They didn't have this admin stuff, but they could actually make arbitrary requests on their behalf by using GitLab's servers. So you could register a webhook, and then here the researcher, he actually demonstrates that, okay, if I put a webhook that points to localhost 80 and then some random file, I would get that, yeah, this file hasn't been found. If I change the port, I'm going to get something like connection refused. So you can use this technique to enumerate the ports that the local server is running. But you could also do other stuff. You could reach other servers which are only reachable by this server. So you can actually break all your system of trust, basically. So any request from this server would be seen as valid from the other systems. So it's pretty dangerous. Yes, and I have some CTF platforms if you want to get started with this. If you are a complete beginner, I would recommend you to try Over the Wire. It's way simpler, and it basically a lot of challenges where you can learn basic Linux commands, and then it goes up to more advanced stuff. And then we have some very standard platforms here, Hack the Box and Try Hack Me. The setup is a little bit different than Pico CTF. You usually get an IP, and you need to do some port scanning of this IP, and then you need to find the vulnerability. It could be a web application vulnerability. It could be some old protocol service that is running there, and you need to exploit that. And then you end up into the machine with a low privilege user, and then you need to find another attack to escalate your privileges to root if you are in Linux, or admin if you are in Windows. Pico CTF, we talked about that already, and CTF Time is basically a platform where we can go and you can see all the running CTFs around the world, and then you can register for them and find also other platforms, etc. Yeah, that was it. Any questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but more like input. If you do the CTF time stuff, look for ranking points, because there are a lot of really, really bad capture the flags where we say they have guessed the flag. You don't. There's no predefined flag format, so you don't actually know when you found the flag, and that's really bad and confusing and not so fun.
Yeah, good input. Yeah.
Will you normally always, not always, but normally, get access to the source code when you explore the applications? That's how you do this game.
No. This challenge contained source code review, but that's not always the case. I mean, it could be a web application that you just have to do more black box pen test and interact with it, send some payloads and see if there is a vulnerability. Do the path enumeration, all those kind of stuff. But it's not always the case that you get access to the source code.
Which one do you think is most fun or rewarding to do?
I like the ones with source code, because I also believe, so when I was doing pen tests, I was always telling to the clients that it's better if they give me access to their source code, because they will just get the most out of it. I mean, I'm there to find the vulnerabilities. Of course, I can spend a week just enumerating the target, but it would be more beneficial for them to have me look at the code and actually spot them faster. But some people, they don't like that. They don't want to share their code. Any other question? Well,
Do you have any questions online? The internet. All right. Maybe one more addition to over the wire. Over the wire helps you to learn basic Linux commands, but if you're into learning PowerShell, there is also a very inspired-ish project that's similar to that one, called Under the Wire, which is exactly the same, but for Windows and PowerShell.
nice. I haven't looked at that, so. Good. Then thank you very much.